It's the SDG Podcast. Before we get started, you can check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com/podcast or find us on all the social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.
Hey, we're back podcasting again. Welcome, everybody. We got Peter Lawrence with us and Chad Juttner, and joining us is James Kirwin to talk about data waste. He's got a passion for like tons of extra data. James, give us a little high level view of what data waste.
Yeah, absolutely. It's essentially the core of it is that it's unused data. All this information that we're storing that doesn't need to be stored. It doesn't have any value or it's not being used. One of the terms we like to use is rot data. It's redundant, obsolete, or trivial, serve any real purpose, and it can just be underutilized data, something where you're using it once and throwing it away instead of making it multi-use.
How do you, redundant data is fairly easy to recognize once you find it. Obsolete data is a lot harder to find daily, right? It didn't start out as obsolete, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's more about, for instance, sales data. That's really important, maybe year over year kind of thing. But if it gets 2-3 years out, it's not valuable anymore. And that's when it kind of becomes obsolete.
Don't salespeople just want to know, 27 years ago, how many widgets did we sell? I'm pretty sure everybody cares as much as they do.
Right. Well, and you talk about that though, but you wanted that total number, but you don't need to go through every individual sale that was made. And so you don't need to keep every individual sale, but maybe some kind of indexed version of it.
Okay. So a roll up or something?
Fear of throwing away something I might need, like the box of cables. The power cord.
That's exactly it.
So I pulled an HP power supply out of the box that we're going to take to recycling. One of our people that didn't have one or forgot it. So it does happen, but it seems like it's so rare that we maybe shouldn't plan our lives around it. Here you have all that junk in the basement, still haven't gotten rid of. Storage has increased. Every character used to matter. Every character used to be a big deal.
Right.
What you name all your, table, your columns and your tables and things like that. And then as storage got huge, we kind of relaxed on that stuff and thought, well, now storage is cheap and we don't have to worry about it.
Right.
Is that a contributing factor?
That's absolutely a contributing factor. And also along those lines is we as a society kind of decided to go paperless. And all we really did was shift that trash from physical paper to digital paper. So all those things that we were just throwing in the trash previously now we're saving in the digital landscape forever. Yeah, you get these literal digital landfills.
Kyle likes me because I keep my email from 2007.
It comes in handy.
Once in a blue moon.
Nuggets on occasion that we needed. So yeah, that's the thing is you run into those situations where you're glad you have it, but then you have to call me and say, my mailbox is full. Can I get more mailbox? And I'm like, you can, and I will do it, but maybe we need to clean up.
Do you think, so James, with all of this basically crap data that we're storing, right? All this nonsense. There's two things that I think of when I think of archiving old application data. Is there a use for analytics for any of that stuff, right? Can we feed that in and see trends or whatever? Is that a reason to keep a lot of that around? So when I think about archival and how much I want to keep stuff around, I think of that. Is there any potential purpose for this stuff to, do some analytics on it, do some, find some, if we're doing sales trends, or if you're doing usage reports, that kind of thing, maybe that's cool to keep that around. And then I'm sure we'll talk about this, but there's probably regulatory guidelines around the type of data and how long you have to keep it for certain legal reasons. And I'm sure that leads to a lot of garbage that we have to maintain.
Yeah,
right?
and I think there's a difference between what I guess we'd call archival data versus literal trash. And there's a huge difference in scope there. So for PCI compliance, I think you're required 7 years but after 2, it might not actually have any direct value to the company. And you can talk about archiving versus destroying. And those are the major things. We've talked previously about the difference between offline archival and online archival. Like,
Yeah.
if it's not using power or direct resources, it's not in the same talk about data waste.
Yeah, I mean, if you
Well, I
store
also
it on
wonder,
a shelf,
depending on your problem domain, depending on what kind of database you have.
Right.
Now that everybody is super excited about AI and machine learning again, there's probably the potential for some utility for some of this garbage data to be fed into some of these models to to do AI training or to
Right.
do some sort of machine learning model around whatever that problem domain is. So maybe I don't want to say that the data hoarders, is that a thing? Like,
Oh, it absolutely is. That is.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to give them credit and say they're right, but maybe a problem manifested itself that just so happened to fit into the thing they think they were solving for, but didn't know existed.
And that's
so what
exactly.
what are other problems? We keep all this stuff. Yeah, storage is an issue. Like, we can't have indefinitely, huge mailboxes and databases and things like that. So besides that, what is the overhead for all
so
that?
There's two ways of looking at this. And fortunately for us in this particular case, they're pretty aligned. There's the ecological perspective in that these huge data centers use up resources. They're making new servers, new hard drives to these new buildings to house them. That takes a lot of resources to do. And a lot of those are rare earth minerals to make these electronics. But it's also a drain on our energy grid. And I think one of the things people think is that everything technology-wise is pretty carbon neutral, and it's just not. It still has a carbon footprint, even if you're not seeing the landfill. But the other side of this is the business side. That data that's not in the right place or isn't tagged or indexed appropriately, that's missed opportunities to use your data. So, Chad, to your point, that data might exist and be the perfect thing for it, but unless we know where it is and how it can be used and it's in a correct format and it's been cleaned up, it's useless. You can't feed. Yeah.
Yeah, the cleaning it up, I think, is super huge. I mean, you can't just take a SQL database and archive it, right?
No.
I mean, me and Peter deal with referential integrity issues all the time, right? So if you don't have a complete picture of that data and probably a good data dictionary or a good, schema design or something, right? Like something that actually tells you what in a lot of my projects, if I lose a couple of core tables, I lose all my referential integrity and I lose the ability to actually make meaningful use out of damn near the entire database.
And that turns the entire thing into waste instead of useful product. Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but all this that you're storing, along with that drain on the energy grid, is a drain on your pocketbook. If 90% of your data is trash, but you're still paying to store it, that's a huge hit to a company. Imagine the costs you could cut by trimming down to just the necessary storage or trading some of that live storage to more archival things.
Yeah, and there's you look at Office 365, we got videos we're creating. We're recording this right now. It's going to go into stream, but it's going to have an expiration date now, unless you turn it off. And so it's somewhat self-cleaning. And, when they first built it, it didn't really have that built in, and it wasn't storing it in people's OneDrives. So it didn't really count, and people never cleaned it up. And I'm wondering what kind of panic button they hit when they realized just how much that was taking of their data centers just for all of that stuff.
Yeah. And actually the video for this podcast is a really great example of how this is going to happen, because you're going to record this. It's going to end up on your OneDrive. You're going to take a copy of it locally, maybe edit it a little bit. You're going to upload it somewhere else. And then somebody might download, like that's in 3 to 5 more places, and it's redundant, completely redundant.
You just described our exact process of what we do with podcasts.
Yeah. So that's the thing, it's a needful thing to take it through those steps, but it does create these redundancies. And then at the end of the process, which one of those versions is your source of truth? So when you get a video later on down the road, 10 years from now in Peter's email,
that's right.
Which one is the correct one? And now you have doubts about your data quality. And now you have to waste time and resources double checking with people and systems to know that that's the right one. So outside the data itself, outside the power usage, you're wasting human resources checking this data again again because you didn't do it in a way that's archivable or indexable, or you didn't plan to create a source of truth. Not that you didn't, I'm just, but you run into those.
I've run into a lot of issues with, with versioning, things like that. And people, Microsoft, when they came out with SharePoint 2007, put in these versioning tools and retention policies and all this stuff that you could use. And people would just put in like this unlimited versioning. It'd be in a library with their PowerPoints, and their PowerPoints would have embedded videos, and they'd be a gigabyte. And then every time they make a change, it's storing a version of it. And all of a sudden, the entire farm is out of storage.
Heck yeah.
It's like, whoops. Also, all of the task stuff that runs behind the scenes, workflow stuff, all that gets stored, and it doesn't clean itself up. So, I've had to go in and find the hidden list where it stores that stuff and set a retention policy on it. That's the stuff that the junk data that just gets stored for no reason. It's like this historical record of GUIDs and other junk like that. It's like, do we need this? Does this do anything for us? But there's never a strategy, or there wasn't for a while at least, like doing that at the start.
Right.
It became one, and then still developing retention policies, very difficult. And it's not.
It is.
That's the thing is, none of these tasks that we need to do to solve these problems, and nobody wants to do them.
The other thing to that point is that the folks who are involved in administrating these data stores are not necessarily the ones who own that data. And they need to work with the folks who do own the data to make those retention policies. And this is where you get into the data governance piece, where the producers and the consumers and the administrators are all talking to make sure we have what we need, only what we need, and only for as long as we need it.
So when is it too late to start? Because, a lot of projects have been, around for decades, right? And you've got decades worth of data that are just hanging out there waiting. Maybe you need to know, I don't know, what the title of a piece of paper was back in, 1999. How do I go about cleaning that up or starting that process?
First of all, I don't think it's ever too late. I think that's like a beautiful example of the sunk cost fallacy. Like it's not too late. You can just go ahead and begin the process. And I don't think you should try to do it all in one go. Going to be piecemeal, but it also requires buy-in across the whole set. Maybe your first step isn't cleanup. Maybe it's putting in policies to limit the growth of it. And then start working on cleanup once you're not creating so much more.
Yeah, like if you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging. You want to stop digging. Yeah. So whatever you can do to stop it from continuing on, like, we have to bail out the boat, otherwise we're going to sink before we. I lost the analogy, but it's interesting because this cuts across so many things. You've got organizational knowledge capture, and then you've got analytics and historical analytics, because you might want to know, hey, we've done all this stuff now. We made all these improvements. Are we really benefiting from it 10 years later? How do you know that stuff? We got the data somewhere. And like you're saying, if you don't know where it is or or what's there, it's all waste. You got to have some kind of way of making sense with it. So that's one of my hopes for AI, is that it could help you make sense of it, but it can't make the decisions for you.
That's correct. Yeah. And I think that is actually, AI is such an interesting, it's solution and the problem. And I think it's going to be the problem before it's the solution.
Yeah.
That's why this is a really important conversation to be having right now, right here at this time, is as we lean more into machine learning, as we lean more into AI, all that data it's going to need to run has to be somewhere. It has to be good data. Garbage in, garbage out is absolutely a term for a reason. And if you're not cleaning that data up before you feed it to your AI, you're going to wreck your AI and have to start over.
That sounds like a fun problem to have, where you've wrecked your investment in AI.
Yeah.
So is things like the Internet Archive, are those trivial or redundant, or?
Boy, that is an ethics question almost, because the truth of storing those backlogs, having that information is extremely useful sometimes. And is it worth storing forever? Kinda, yeah. But
Yeah, but not.
It reminds me of the commercial.
both, maybe.
Reminds me of the commercial where the guy finds the one piece of wood that he's been saving for 10 years to fix this one problem. And we all have that junk wood pile that, if it gets full, we'll take some out and throw some away. But if it's not full, then it's not a problem. But I almost wonder, okay, so if I'm starting a new project, that's probably the best time. It's kind of like the planting a tree theory, right? The best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago. The second best time is now. So if I'm starting a project, what are some things or safeguards that I can put in place to watch for data wastage? Because especially at the start, you're just throwing data here, there, everything, right?
And that's what I was kind of getting at earlier with the data governance, is getting that communication between the consumer or the producer and the consumer. Because when we're starting an application project, like a web app, we're inclined to just scrape all the information and store that.
Yeah.
But if it's not useful information, any piece you store that's not going to be used by the consumer is waste. So having that conversation up front when you're architecting your system, when you're architecting your project, and knowing what's going to be useful. And I know you can't always know what's going to be useful. But if you have a better idea and you can trim off some pieces, just limit. I like using a term we borrow from physical waste management. And everybody's heard it: reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. And it kind of comes back to Chad's point earlier about using that data. Maybe it is useful. So reduce is take only what you can use. Don't duplicate it across multiple places. Make a single location for it. At least then you're minimizing the impact. Reduce or reuse. If that data isn't useful here, maybe it's useful to someone else. Open it up to being more useful, and don't bring in data just for a single use. We're going to check it one time and throw it away, because even though we're not storing it, we've created this entire pipeline of moving that data that's all taking power and requirements and people and time and money. So much wasted money to just throw it away. Yeah. And that's, we're trying to architect these systems so we're not just creating all this inefficiencies or duplications.
It almost seems like a lot of the data that we had early on. So I know a lot of the times, I'm a lot more lenient with my schemas and everything else.
Right.
And so I add a bunch of stuff to everything because I don't know early on, even after doing a lot of discovery on projects and investigations and everything else, you don't know what you're going to need and what's going to be garbage data.
Certainly.
But then a lot of those extraneous fields, they almost become like tech debt, right? And so defending the architects and the originators of these applications, addressing tech debt, rarely on a product owner's to-do list, right? It's features, it's functionality, it's, move forward, move forward, move forward. Let's address, we are actually adding, if we cut these extra fields, if we actually, trim our data set, unless you can demonstrate, some sort of operational efficiency, like, hey, if we actually get rid of all this crap data, our queries are going to be 15% faster. The site's going to look faster. It's going to be a performance boost. But if we just say, hey, we've got all this garbage data, it's tech debt that we, because we didn't, addressing that later on in a project we're prioritizing that in a project's life cycle can be trickier than it sounds.
Certainly, yeah.
Because it has to go through the whole test loop and everything else, yeah.
And that's why I kind of bring myself back around to mentioning the money as often as possible.
Yeah.
The adage, a penny saved is a penny earned. And that is very true with these systems. For an application cleaning up tech debt, et cetera, maybe that doesn't have real world money attached to it. But for cleaning up data, that storage, that costs money. And it can literally save a company a ton of money. There's a quote from an archivist: only about 5% of anything is worth saving. And if that's true for data as well, 95% of what you're paying to store isn't creating any benefit to you.
Has the, I know I've heard, for a while now, as storage costs, especially in the cloud, get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And people kind of advertise that, right? Storage is cheap. So go nuts. The storage is cheaper than the cost of addressing tech debt in a lot of places. So I would imagine, James, your job is probably really hard, kind of justifying it's not just the storage, right? I mean, it's not just the price; it's the there's a lot of other factors that come into play here, and I agree. Creating I mean, just the environmental impacts of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, storage is cheap. A lot of this crap isn't recyclable. Like the actual physical components that are holding your crap data are actually hurting us. So
right.
yeah, that's
Well, there's a lot of compute power behind that too. You're indexing and moving that around. You're replicating it across your data centers. All of that. It's cheap, but cheap isn't free. All those little micro billions of a penny add up because we're doing this. We are moving forward at an incredibly high rate, and we are sloppy. That's just how you're taking pictures on your phone that are gigantic, a billion megapixels, so that you can share them in an email or on social media. You're not printing a billboard, but our camera settings, all this stuff is
Oh,
Go to the max, man.
Yeah,
that's actually a great point. I mean, I literally, right before this meeting, I took my team out for lunch and I took a picture of the receipt for lunch so I can expense it. When I upload that to Salesforce, we've got a 10 megabyte limit on the size of an attachment. And I'm always reminded that the iPhones will always, always, always take a massively, the photos you take are a massive size, right?
They are.
And so, oops, I got to delete that. Now it's part of my iCloud, blah, 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 right? But I think the bigger point that Kyle's coming up with here is there's a consumer side of this, right? Us, just day-to-day users of literally everything, creating all this garbage data. And then there's the part that maybe we have a little bit more control over, James, with the business side, where businesses are creating just mountains and piles of garbage data that they don't need.
Right.
And we have, as consultants for these companies, we have the ability to kind of control that.
Right. Well,
it would be nice to be to consult for Apple and say, hey, maybe the default photo size doesn't need to be. I don't need to see every single atom of that picture of my receipt from Schuler's. I don't.
The AI should recognize that it's a receipt and limit it down to a small amount of pixels, right?
That's actually not a bad idea.
Well, and I think that gets back to the core of the whole thing. Much like physical waste, individuals have control over what they're wasting and whatever, but the vast majority of it and the beginning of it starts with our companies.
Do you think this has been a problem for a while, or do you think, so I've got a theory that maybe this data waste thing started with Gmail. Like when Gmail came out, they came out and they said, hey, everybody gets 1 gig of email storage for free. And back when that was out in like 2004, it blew everybody's minds. We're like, what are you doing? How can you, how is that possible? And now the free spaces, you get like 10 gig, I forget how much, but it's still kind of a ridiculous amount. So on the consumer side, it feels like that kind of kicked off this free storage arms race.
The cloud as a whole is the beginning of this. When you stopped having to have eyes on physical storage next to you. When
and
you
having to add it yourself, right?
Yeah. When you were no longer responsible for plugging in another hard drive or another server, and that you weren't seeing those hardware costs, both on the install and the replacements and everything. When it became kind of nebulous, became kind of hidden, you just weren't seeing those costs anymore.
Yeah, when you crash your server because you left your logging turned on without any cleanup, and it just fills it with everything.
Yep.
It's a concern.
Never done that, except for those many times.
But back in the day, if you were taking a ton of backups on your SQL server, you could crash your hard drive because the backups alone would take up everything if you weren't cleaning them up. Yeah.
I remember, it wasn't that long ago that I had to intentionally limit log sizes on, Java applications because default settings are go nuts, take as much space as you want.
Right.
And I think, Peter, we both probably had to deal with server crashes because a log file somewhere filled up a disk that also shared space with temp space. And if you can't write a temp file, then you can't write a lot of things, and it just blows things up. So I do kind of miss those days. Nowadays, we have things like Datadog and the Elk Stack and all of these tools that you just, and Amazon has CloudWatch, right? Like you just throw your logs out there and maybe you put a retention policy on it. Maybe you completely forget to.
Logs are one of those things that, how old does the data have to be completely useless, right?
One
Like, exactly. Like, who's going to go back more than a week and look at your log file and go, oh yeah, I see, we've had this problem for a while now.
Yeah,
Digital
and it's another-
archaeologists,
It's another example of what James was talking about too, where like 99.99% of logs are probably completely unnecessary.
Right.
Right? Like you need them when things go wrong, and you need them to refer back to once in a while, maybe. But holy crap! Like, do you really need that many?
No.
Do you need 10
No.
gigs of logs for that? I mean, you're literally probably looking for 2 lines. In my language, Java is a huge culprit here, right? Because when I print a stack trace is, probably 100 lines, and I need the top one. So my language is a huge offender of unnecessary log space.
Well, and even just between your environments, let's take Java, for instance, in dev, you want it to log everything. In QA, maybe only up to alert. And then in prod, warnings, you're only down to the last little bit. But if you don't change those log settings per environment, you're logging everything in prod with 1 billion users or something.
Yeah, we've all made that mistake of setting it to debug and walking away and coming back the next week and go, oh, whoops, I guess that should be set back to error levels only or warns, right?
Yeah. And you talk about these things, and it's just about being conscientious. The whole conversation is going to be, the solution is being conscientious, planning ahead, knowing these. And it gets easier if the organization as a whole agrees upon pieces. When it moves from dev to QA, we walk it back. When it goes from QA to prod, we walk it back further. Right. And so you're not saving those things forever and ever. Or
so
at least less of it.
What are the high value targets right now that people can tackle? Getting people to make their to intentionally make their own lives worse so that in the future they can make them better is difficult.
Yeah, that's valid. That's valid. I think the number one low-hanging fruit is having those conversations ahead of time. What should we be storing and for how long? Like I was saying with the sales pieces, you don't need them for 20 years. I don't think. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to help you, especially sales trends like the specific product. Those are out of date almost the second they're selling and that kind of thing. So if you have that conversation with your sales team or your business intelligence team, you could put those policies in place before the project even starts. Maybe that's a universal piece. The other low-hanging fruit, I would say, is that data you have that you migrated from on-prem into the cloud, like you didn't throw away anything before you moved houses.
Why would I look at it when I'm just going to move it all?
The phrase I used to use was same garbage, new can.
Has it been accessed at any point in time in the last 2 years? Do you actually need it?
Even having the tools that monitor that, not modified date, created date, but how many times it was just accessed, it's not there. I mean, it didn't used to be. I used to do migrations from file shares into SharePoint, and I worked with organizations to clean up and organize their data, and it was always a challenge. And there's a lot of skill sets across this whole problem. And you talk about retention policy. You talk about some stuff you got to keep a long time, some stuff you can't. You got to get rid of it. And understanding those, and understanding like when you're going into developing an application, intentionally being streamlined.
Yeah.
So Chad and Peter, what on your projects, like, is that part of that process when you start out?
Traditionally has not been a big part of that process. Having this conversation helps us think about that and like think about trying to get rid of some leftover data. As senior folks, as you go through and you start looking at tech debt, having some of this data having data that nobody knows what it's used for or why it's there, or it benefits no one because nobody wants to delete it. I don't know what it's used for. Might be something super important. Don't want to be the person to pull the plug on, a number one super project. But at the same time, nobody's using it. No, it hasn't changed. You can look at it and you'd be like, yeah, the last created date was 2014. Are we really using this data? Are we sure about that? 10-year-old data? But getting folks on board with that and having that process in place is a challenge and one that I think is probably going to be a little bit more top of mind for me going
Absolutely.
forward.
Even in your you're writing a blog post, could it be a paragraph, or does it have to start with a 5-page story about your life experience and things that happened and all that, illustrating your point, just the way we operate.
I really like the example of the blog post because blog posts tend to have hashtag keywords, whatever, depending on your platform. And one of the big discussions around data waste is metadata and being able to put something in there. Because sometimes you look at this data and it could be super useful, but from the top level, you look at it and you go, what even is this? Like,
Right.
Where did this come from? How old is it? Who did what where? But if it had some metadata that could tell you that information, decision making on keep, throw, use is
Right.
much easier.
Finding a database full of blog posts and knowing that you don't have a blog anywhere that's active might be one of those like, hey, we have data, we're not using it. Can we archive it at least? At the very least, let's get it off of the cloud, get it off of the active list,
Yeah.
and put it somewhere safe. It'll still be there.
I think this is another. So I was thinking about the blog post. Maybe not brevity is the key to like eliminating data waste, but all of the data we attach. Right. So a blog post is an easy thing to talk about because everybody understands what that is. Right.
Right.
We attach a lot of metadata to that. Right. Like the date posted, the last updated date, and the tags. Right.
Topics
And there's a lot of stuff that we attach to every and I would argue that probably that metadata is more actual storage than the post itself or the image associated with the post, probably.
Can be, yeah.
Yeah.
And in the future, as AI capabilities get better and better and cheaper and faster, you might not even need to actually store that as metadata. You could just use a large language model to say, here's some text, create my tags for me. So, go through my database and make these ephemeral data elements instead of like hard storage things that we need, right? And that would save, I don't know that would save space. It would just transfer the same problem that James is talking about to AI usage and all of the ethical and environmental concerns that are associated with AI.
If you think about, a shirt and the tag has the metadata. How long do you want that tag to be? Does it need to have the color? Does it need to have like the sleeve length?
We can't tell what color a shirt is just by looking at it.
Right. And AI will be able to look at it and go, that's a 3XL. That's made by this. That's the color. I can tell you all that if you just ask me, but we don't need to store it all somewhere.
Right. And that's a great example too, because like when you're putting your t-shirts away, you put them in your t-shirt drawer. You don't just huck them into a random drawer in your dresser and hope you can find it later.
Wow.
You don't know me at all, do you?
Listen, somebody's reading Marie Kondo over here.
Doesn't bring me joy.
Marie Kondo is onto something though. And in Marie Kondo's world, it's does this bring you joy? In the business world, it's does this bring you value?
Right.
If it's not producing, then why is it there?
And risk plays another side of it, right? We no longer store credit card numbers, though. Back in I don't know when we stopped because it's been so long, but there have been times that
2008 is when the PCI compliance became a lot more strict.
That's when everything went hammers down.
Yep.
But even before then, people were like, we really shouldn't have a database full of credit card numbers, expiration dates, and everything else to be hacked into, right?
So there's policies that can run and, behind the scenes, data loss prevention and discovery and things like that. There's all these tools that are available to say, hey, that's a credit card number that's in this document. That's a social security number that's in here, and flag those, and then you can take action. I've got some cleanup things that run on sites. Every time you create a group or a team, or you have all this bloat behind the scenes, and it's like, okay, the flag is this one file that gets stored way in the system, like that just is there for no reason, but it exists in every site. So I get a warning when a site's deleted because that thing disappears. And like the skill sets, that's what it goes back to for me is like, okay, organize your dream team to deal with this stuff. who needs to be there?
I think that's a question for you, James.
Oh, I know, and it's a difficult thing to answer. Again, these are data waste is not a new topic, but it's kind of a newly considered topic. So not all the solutions exist. It's going to be a lot of having those conversations and what can we do as technology leaders to make good decisions. I was thinking about Chad's example of when you're taking the iPhone picture, is it the megapixels or is it the geocaching data they locked into it that's all part of the metadata and like how much of that? Not only that, but when you send it via email, it's then in the server and on their local system and. But if you have it in SharePoint, you're sharing a reference to it, not the file itself. And that reduces your overhead for storage as well. So making those application choices.
We have governance on the HQ on our intranet where we overwrite. We say only save so many versions. We overwrite it so the links always work. And you provide links to people, not the files. And we share things. We go to the document. We don't bring the document to us. There's just all these things you can do intentionally to prevent this bloat from happening, or at least happen slower.
Right.
Accuracy is when you have all these duplication of documents and versions. They still usually only have one owner and one person that updates those things and keeps that source of truth.
Right.
And then everybody else has a copy on their desktop that's 6 versions old. And just looking for things.
Right.
They used to say like you spend 20% of your time finding what you need.
And that's even along the lines of when you're doing web app design. Is it in your local repo or are we using CDNs? And that giving permission to share. And I know this is a touchy topic with businesses sharing your data so somebody else doesn't have to store it too.
Right.
And maybe they'll share back so that you don't have to store it. And
CDNs terrify me, right? Like, and as a developer or as an architect, anything that's outside of my control, right? Like not that all of my products and all of my infrastructure and everything has 100% uptime. It's really hard to tell third parties. I mean, even as bulletproof as CDNs have become these days, it's hard, if something happens, it's hard to say, yeah, that thing is down. I don't know when it'll be back.
Right.
And so, yes, in a perfect world, everybody would like understand and accept that minimal amount of risk and, kind of accept it as a trade-off to like, this is a benefit to kind of everybody. But
I come from a background in e-commerce, and we had made the decision in our architecting to use CDNs for the front end, but as soon as you got to the checkout, it was all local because that was too important to be risking. And we didn't want to introduce security issues. And so you can split the difference. You can decide what's not as important so you can limit your exposure, or what is super important to limit your exposure. What's not as important, go ahead and use the CDN.
Yeah.
And I think in having these discussions, the discussion of risk is probably going to be more moving to some than, it goes back to like the credit card. If you store a credit card number, that's fine. But now you have the risk of if anything happens, now the PCI folks really, really unhappy with you. And you're going to have to explain that. Is that storage of that data really that valuable that you are willing to take that risk? 99.9% of the time, nobody's willing to take that risk, right? Only a crazy person would store a credit card number. There's so many ways to not store a credit card number now that...
And it's why you'll see a lot of these e-commerce sites now where the checkout powered by, because there's one company taking the risk for a bunch of other companies.
Right.
I think Stripe is one you'll be seeing a lot. They handle the checkout because they will store the credit card, but that's their whole thing. That's all they do, and that's their risk because they understand that.
Right. Right.
Well, I think, that's a good point. The services and the tools, I think, all exist to help deal with this problem. But there's just like, you have to have, this is the thing, like AI is going to take over. No, you have to have decision-making capabilities. You have to have skill sets. It's a tool. It's not going to be the answer. It can recognize it's a receipt and it's got the address on it. So we don't need the latitude and longitude. We don't need this to be the size of a billboard. Those things I think are coming, or like they should be. Chad and Peter, you could maybe build that.
I'm on it. I use some of my free time.
Yeah.
Yeah. this is such a big topic. Any parting thoughts before we shut her down?
Be conscious of what you're doing with your data. Take only what you need.
I think that's a good parting thought is to think first. We used to have to think first a lot more than we do now, and it doesn't hurt to get back to that.
Absolutely.
And then I would say, think about how to have those conversations with your product owner about, eliminating some of the cruft, some of the barnacles, scraping some of the barnacles off of your schema. And maybe we as SDG could actually come up with a really good story to tell around, some successes with doing that.
Right.
And also be conscious of some of the data waste and some of the hope and dreams behind, keeping all this stuff for like whatever future benefit it might have in the future. You're probably just going to create additional problems if you keep doing
Right.
that. So,
And I would say be willing to, not buy into the sunk cost fallacy and go, okay, we thought like when it was Christmas morning and we were developing all the requirements and we thought we were going to know stuff, being able to stop and go, okay, we didn't need all of this. So we're just going to stop doing it. Or we're going to get rid of it, clean it up, but be willing to admit you have a problem.
Very cool.
It's the first step. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And I think with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Solution Design Group is a digital product consultancy in Minneapolis. Check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.